Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University. Today I'll be talking about dictatorship, and my presentation will be based on the dictatorship, a phenomena that was very prominently felt in between the two world wars. Now these two world wars, World War number 1 from 1914 to 1918 and World War II from 1939 to 1945, was the period when the world saw the worst form of governments, that is the dictatorship. Now, these two world wars were a procession of crumbling democracies, if we say that, it won't be inappropriate, and it led to the emergence of dictatorship in many lands: Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia. That was the soil which was too hard to find roots and deep roots for democracies. Now the storm of crisis after the end of First World War, it laid the grounds for the rise of dictatorship. Now the rise of dictatorship in these countries was the product of socio-economic tension and the crisis which the First World War created. So in the hour of crisis, man loses faith and craves for new refuge where they can get some sort of security and some sort of stability, and democracies were not providing that, and dictatorship ensured that people get at least some assurance in the form of stability and development in the future. Now if you look at the causes and go into the causes of the rise of dictatorship, we find the Treaty of Versailles. It was like a dead weight on the national life of Germany. It crippled Germany both politically and economically, and the mounting unemployment, the hyperinflation, the complete breakdown of economic system, and above all, the political humiliation led to the loss of faith among the German peoples for democratic values and tradition. Now this created a moral crisis, and people of Germany, in their search for national glory and security, found in Hitler a powerful champion of their cause. Now if you look at Italy, in Italy we find there was a desperation for compensating the losses suffered during the First World War, and that was the compensation was assured by Mussolini. Now faced with the problem of insufficiency of land and an expanding population, Mussolini was the man of the hour, and he was promising those two. Now Japan had to embark upon a policy of expansion, and the dictatorship arose to give the policy necessary thrust and drive. So mass dissatisfaction, for which the war was greatly responsible. Coupled with, we find in Russia Lenin's masterly understanding of the objectives of the situation and his unrivaled strategy for the establishment of the communist dictatorship in Russia. So worldwide depression in 1930s led to an economic collapse which further discredited the democratic system and strengthened the forces of dictatorship. So the reason for the rise of dictatorships in the crisis-ridden period between the two world wars could be discovered in the psychology of crisis conditions. As Lipson observes, a society in crisis will be urged to submit to a pattern of discipline and thus reassert its unity and solidarity. So authoritarianism will be represented as a source of strength because it is supposedly sufficient and single-minded and fast-moving. So Japan, it embarked upon the policy of expansion. Dictatorship arose to give the policy of this expansionist policy a necessary thrust and drive, and the mass dissatisfaction was also causing a great kind of desire to have a military kind of dictatorship. Now here we find the institution of dictatorship which was prevalent in ancient period. If you compare the dictatorship the modern and the traditional, we find that the modern version of dictatorship was completely different from its traditional one. Because we find in Rome the dictatorship, which was in its traditional form, it was more of a product of political expediency, and it was basically taken upon itself the cause of removing that emergency which arose, and in response to which the dictatorship was thrust upon them. So it was never considered to be a permanent political institution. So when the emergency passed off, the dictator had to relinquish the seat of power. Secondly, the Roman dictatorship did never involve a break from legality. It was a constitutionally sanctioned political authority. As McIver, he observes, saying, the Roman dictatorship was a constitutional device under which the constitution was suspended during a grave crisis of the state. So traditional dictatorship was a form which was in fact provided in the constitution itself. It was to tackle and to tide over the emergency situation, and it was fully authorized and fully legalized by the constitutional mechanism. So in Rome, dictatorship was not the break from constitutionalism or from the legal aspect, but it was in fact the continuation of the legal principles which supported it. Now, when we contrast this traditional aspect of dictatorship with the modern one, we find that modern dictatorship is an extra-constitutional development, and it involves a sharp break from legality and tradition. So it is the product of force, and the force creates as well as sustains it. Secondly, the modern dictatorship is permanent in nature. The efforts of a modern dictator to remain in power permanently through a planned process of physical and psychological coercion distinguishes it from the traditional form of dictatorship. Now, thirdly, we find a modern dictator rests his power on the active support of an associated class. So there is a class of people or a constituency which supports the dictatorship, and it supports in all conditions. So Hercules, with the active assistance of an organized political party, that is what an image of a dictator is. This political party is organized, and the rules which that political party proposes, it supports that dictator. So even a superficial survey of dictatorship in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and communist Russia and China will show the prevalence of all these distinguishing characteristics of modern dictatorship in present time as well. Now, if you see the characteristics of this modern version of dictatorship, we find that dictators, they blur the distinction between society and the state, and between the state and government. The identification of society are with the state and of the state with the government justifies total control of human life by political authority. Now, the rules, they control the whole concept of human needs and interest. Autonomy of different spheres of life is well expressed by Mussolini when he says everything for the state, nothing against the state, and nothing outside the state. Hence, monoism is complete in the totalitarian state, and the ruling authority in democracy, on the other hand, because of its clear distinction between society and the state, between the state and the government, does not encompass the whole life of man. So democracy is essentially pluralistic, where the autonomy of different spheres of life is respected and tolerated, and it recognizes a variety of level of personal and collective endeavors which are altogether outside the sphere of politics. Then we find in modern day version of dictatorship ideological uniformity. Now, ideological uniformity is the very foundation of totalitarianism and the state which is based on that. Now, here Justice Holmes observes that there is no free trade in ideas. It naturally leads to unity of power. All power is deposited and concentrated in one man or one party. Totalitarian state is one idea and one state, hence it is one party state. As one of the scholars, Barbu observes, the party molds the individual and his society according to an idea which comprises in itself the present and the future possibilities of man. So the ideal society would sooner or later suppress every empirically constituted and naturally grown forms of society, and the plurality of ideas is contrarily the core of democracy. So this plurality is bulldozed into uniformity, and all indications of diversity or differentiations are leveled in the process of unifying everything with the help of ideology which believes in just one aspect or one party or one leader. So, because of this ideological uniformity, democracy is characterized by coexistence of different political parties engaged in peaceful competition, whereas in dictatorship there is no such coexistence is ever tolerated or allowed to exist. Now, another aspect where this aspect of dictatorship differs from democracy is that of elitism and equalitarianism. Like power and privileges are functionally related to each other. Monopoly of power invariably leads to monopoly of privileges. So in totalitarian state, as Lipson observes, through monopoly of power by one party, a new type of privilege is established to which political power provides the entry. So it is a new class, a new idea, or a new state altogether. Now this is given an eloquent expression to the level where it becomes a new normal. So the totalitarian system is profoundly oligarchical, where different grades of ranks and privileges are found to exist, and if don't exist, they are created. That's how the differentiation is made. On the other hand, democracy, we find it prevents the growth of permanent monopoly of power through presentation of alternate or alternative parties. Hence, no particular class of citizen can permanently enjoy social privileges in democracy, whereas in dictatorship, such differences are deliberately created to bring about the concept of elitism and the commoners. Then on another aspect where differentiation can be made is that of the authoritarianism versus responsibility. Now authoritarian system is especially a system which is heading towards totalitarianism. So the ruling class, which is the custodian of all authority, vows and it allows no responsibility to the people. So the cult of dominance and leadership is prized above everything else. So both its version, fascism, communism, we find that it believes in inalienable and revolutionary right of the party to guide the destiny of the people. So both are authoritarian in sense, as in the army, authority resides in a few who are responsible for but not responsible to many. In a fascist or communist dictatorship in the ruling party, we find it is endowed with so much supremacy that it absorbs the state instead of merely acting as its tool for the benefit of people. So democracy, on the other hand, is a basically responsible government answerable to the people. In democracy, we find the responsibility of the authority to the people is secured through free organization of rival opinions and periodical elections. Then another aspect where we find it different from democracy is that of omniscience versus pragmatism. Now dictatorship, by proclaiming infallibility of a particular doctrine and by assigning a predetermined primacy to political authority, it creates a society of myth. In such a system, reason tends to die out and people are indoctrinated into blind obedience to the political authority. Now, through a peculiar amalgamation of education, propaganda, and coercion, the myth of authority is created and sustained, and eventually the people develop a habit of blind obedience to the authority. As Mussolini bluntly pointed out, saying that we have created our myth. The myth is a faith, and it's a passion, and our myth is the nation. So, democracy denies the infallibility of a man or of a doctrine, as Feiner observes, saying democracies admit the pragmatic nature of their search for perfection or pragmatic nature. So, their search for perfection and recognition that of perfection there is no single exclusive principle, yet they surmise that if such there should be, it is one yet to be discovered in a process of evolution, and that if the unfolding is to arrive at soundness, it must be founded on the unfettered expression and interplay of all opinions. So, perfection is something which is just a mirage, and in search of that mirage, a difference of opinion. Then let's talk about the merit of dictatorship. Now, certain advantages are claimed for dictatorship. In a democracy, parties create cleavages in the society by magnifying the points of disagreement. Now, this is against the cause of national unity, and contrarily, in a dictatorship, only one party exists, and hence the national life does not suffer from any internal dissension or split. So, by eliminating the source of conflict, dictatorship lays down a sound foundation for national solidarity. So, dictatorship admirably answers the needs of an emergency. To effectively meet an emergency calls for quick decision and immediate mobilization of all social forces. This requires a fast-moving, unified political machinery. So, under a dictatorship, because of unity of power, a decision can be easily drawn and very quickly reached without any long-drawn discussion. So, its political machinery can immediately be geared to the requirements of an emergency. Now, historically, dictatorship is associated with administrative efficiency and quick economic progress. Now, with total control over individual life, it becomes easy to accelerate the rate of economic and technological growth in dictatorship. That is the reason a spectacular economic and scientific development in Soviet Russia during the last 4 decades, that is after and around the First World War and the Second World War, is the time when it is eloquently talked about the efficiency of dictatorial system. However, this should not be generalized, because a number of dictatorships are notorious for inefficient and corrupt rules. What is therefore important is not the ambit of power, but its use for developmental purposes. And if we look at the demerits of dictatorship, we find that the classic vice of all dictatorial systems is their basic assumption of the superiority and infallibility of those in power. Now, those in authority, because of their claim of infallibility, feel tempted to glorify power. And this in turn is sure to produce some adverse reactions. So, power, when glorified, has a tendency to grow into despotism. As Acton says, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Secondly, some major mistakes in decision making and execution are not unusual in dictatorship, as the power conscious rulers are not confronted with necessary limits and criticism. And the claim of infallibility invariably increases the possibility of errors. Through interplay of opinions, the error can be minimized, but here, when the opposite views are not even allowed to exist, so the possibility of error in judgment and decision making increases further. The dictatorial state is one idea state which is necessarily hostile to ideological multiformity. Now, freedom of thought is allowed only within the rigid frame of the ruling ideology. Every individual must conform to the standards set by the state, and the denial of freedom of thought amounts to the denial of the opportunity for articulating the expression of personality, and in the absence of which man cannot realize his best self, and the power is a mixture of force and consent. And since the source of power in dictatorship is not consent of the people, it has to maintain power through continuous employment of force. And force without consent becomes misdirected and ultimately shakes the foundation of the state. Now, in any evaluation of two rival ideologies, dictatorship is believed to have a distinct advantage over democracy. Dictatorship, because of its total and absolute creed, is efficient in mobilizing all social energy for solving the emergent problem of the society. Now, this sometimes makes possible accelerated economic and technological progress, but dictatorship has some major vices. Now, first, because of the absence of any major checks and opposition, the governing class has a tendency to glorify power, which ultimately grows despotic in nature. However, when a body of men become extremely power conscious, they are apt to commit serious errors for which the country may suffer. Secondly, in evaluation, we find that in a dictatorship, people have no practical remedy for the injustice and inefficiency of the government. In the absence of the opportunity for the organizing alternative ways of political thinking, the people have no freedom to choose a new government. So, the denial of freedom to make and unmake government compels the people to stomach every injustice meted out by the ruling class. Then, the dictatorship is not conducive to the mental upliftment of the people. Government, as Mill said, is a great influence acting on the human mind. So, accordingly, it elicits or fails to elicit its energy. So, dictatorship, as it does not afford the people any real opportunity to participate in the process of government, fails to enlist for its operation active will and energy of the people. Now, because of structural rigidity, its framework does not permit of the elimination of its innate vices, and it continues. So, democracy in comparison it possesses some abiding values. The interlocking system functioning through the multiple checks minimizes democracy the possibility of overgrowth of power and makes continuous enjoyment of freedom by the people a possibility. So, democratic government, as McIver observes, is less dependent on psychology of power, and consequently the possibility of government committing mistakes is reduced. Secondly, democracy allows the people adequate remedy against governmental injustice. The people have the necessary freedom to make or unmake the government. This makes the government abide by the interest of the people. Lastly, the democracy, by allowing the people to actively participate in the process of government, abide in their mental development as well. So, the conditions which are against democracy or responsible for the rise of dictatorship there are some forces in democratic countries which threaten the foundation of democracy and helps in rise of the dictatorship. And the first is that democracy, because of its association with the liberal creed of non-intervention, is characterized by an archaic condition of unplanned economy. Now, the cyclical ups and downs in industrial activity, the constant fear of mass unemployment and gross distributive injustice, it tend to destroy the vitality of democracy. In the opinion of Walter Lippmann, these things breed a condition sometimes characterizes the democratic regime. It emerges from the periodic economic breakdowns and occasional war situations. So, the masses, it is said, are haunted by the ghost of insecurity and anxiety. Thirdly, the impersonal forces of modern economy lead to increasing isolation and powerlessness of individual. Now, this results in the imbalance of man. It is often found that it is a democracy where the dearth of adequate institution for correcting this imbalance are present. So, besides democracy's decision making and decision implementing machineries are not so fast moving, and efficiency as a result is confronted by a system where it doesn't works. So, democracy, as Barker writes, is not in its nature congenial to rapid decision making, nor is its administrative machinery effective for quick implementation of all these factors, and which creates instability and tension within the structure of democracy, which are exploited by anti-democratic political elements. And in a class and caste-ridden undeveloped society where the poverty and unemployment are widespread, democracy becomes increasingly feeble. The objective condition in this type of society hinders what McIver says, the process of maturation which democracy badly requires. So, when men are deprived of bare livelihood and the interclass and intercaste tension reaches the point of a crisis, politics becomes increasingly factional and democracy loses its proper environment. So, besides democracy's decision making and decision implementing machineries are not so fast moving, and efficiency as a result suffers, so there need to be some remedies. So, we come to now the remedies, and we find the future of democracy depends on the ability to find out new ways and new institutions with a view to eliminating tension and its structures. So, firstly, comprehensive planning is a necessity. The organization of planning will introduce the much needed element of economic stability and justice in the society. Now, this in turn will prevent the emergency or emergence of any major crisis in society which nurses the forces of dictatorship. Secondly, planning from top must be combined with active participation from below. So, decentralization is a necessary complement to economic planning, and this will correct the centralizing tendency inherent in planned economy. And then it will create essential conditions for economic development. Thirdly, democracy must find out new ways of toning up its administrative machinery, of introducing more expertness and efficiency in its scale of operations. And lastly, there must be increasing political education of the people in anti-democratic sources and techniques. Now, democracy, if it is to survive, it must have a mature awareness of major problems of contemporary world and must explore effective ways of tackling those problems. In brief, democracy, to meet the totalitarian challenges, must be combined with the core of socialism, its stability and justice consciousness. At the same time, it must reject the totalitarian implications of socialism. So, the face of democracy should be polished and not disfigured through the alliance with socialism. So, the problems that confront the democracy in the underdeveloped countries of Asia and Africa are all the more acute. So, democracy in these countries has been alternating between hope and despair. So, the real problem before democracy in these regions has to assure a minimum standard of living to the teeming millions suffering from poverty and to endear the government to the masses in general, so that the estrangement between the rulers and the rule, that is the political gap, it can be corrected. Now, eminent authors have expressed their belief in the permanence of democracy by their eloquent praise, but then the dictatorship has always raised its ugly head from among the democratic countries, and whenever there are extremes in economy or in political segregation or discrimination, men have always looked for a charismatic leader who could ensure and assure that, and such demagogues are always there in democracy who take opportunity and who make the best use of that available opportunity and make the masses move to their dictate, and they undermine the democratic institutions and establish their despotic dictatorial regimes. Now with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thanks for watching. Thank you.